Her hands glowed in the dark. She kept the glowing vials by her bed like nightlights. Decades later, those same hands would not stop trembling. The element that made her the most famous scientist alive was the same one that was killing her. She was born in a country that did not legally exist. The world tried to destroy her twice, once for being a woman, once for being human. This is the story of the woman who lit up the world and paid for it with her life. Her name was Marie Curie.
Warsaw, 1867. Poland had not existed as an independent nation for nearly a century. Maria Skłodowska was born the youngest of 5 children to 2 schoolteachers. Her father taught physics. He kept his instruments locked behind glass, but he let her look. Under Russian rule, speaking Polish in school was forbidden. Polish history was erased from the books. Children lived in fear of surprise inspections, where one wrong word could ruin a family. Tuberculosis took her mother when Maria was only 10 years old. 2 years earlier, she had already lost her eldest sister to typhus. Grief became something she learned early and carried quietly. Despite everything, she graduated at the top of her class with a gold medal. She was 16. There was no university in Poland that would admit a woman, so she worked as a governess and waited. In secret, she joined the Flying University illegal classes for women, held in private apartments, moving constantly to avoid the police. Her elder sister Bronisława went ahead to Paris to study medicine. Maria stayed behind to fund her, working, saving, waiting her turn. Whenever she could, she practiced real chemistry in a makeshift laboratory set up by a cousin, her first taste of the work that would define her life. In 1891, at the age of 24, Maria finally boarded a train for Paris. She traveled in a 4th-class carriage, sitting on a folding stool to save every franc she could. She would never again call herself Maria. From this day, she became Marie. Paris in 1891 was everything Warsaw could not be: free, modern, alive with ideas. She enrolled at the Sorbonne to study physics and mathematics. Of nearly 2,000 students, only 23 were women. Her attic room had no heating. In winter, she piled every piece of clothing she owned onto her bed just to sleep. She sometimes fainted from hunger, having spent her last coins on books instead of food. Within 2 years, she earned her degree in physics, first in her class. A year later, a second degree in mathematics. Now a graduate with nowhere to work, she needed something rare in Paris: laboratory space willing to take in a woman. To isolate whatever was hiding inside pitchblende, they needed enormous quantities of it. Tons, not grams. Marie did the heaviest labor herself, stirring boiling cauldrons of ore residue with an iron rod nearly as tall as she was. She later wrote, "I was so absorbed I forgot to eat or sleep." Her hands ached constantly from the acid and the labor. Each batch of ore had to be dissolved, filtered, and crystallized, over and over, in agonizingly slow cycles. It would take 4 years of this punishing routine before they held anything resembling a pure sample. In July 1898, from that speck, they identified a brand new element, far more radioactive than uranium itself. She named it polonium, after Poland, the homeland that did not yet exist on any map. It was perhaps the first chemical element ever named to make a political statement. But the data still did not add up. Something else, even more radioactive, was still hiding in the ore. One night, returning to the shed after dark, they noticed the bottles themselves were glowing, a soft, ghostly blue light. Pierre later wrote that they would sit in the dark just to watch their discovery glow, like a quiet fire that gave off no heat. They named the second element radium, from the Latin word for ray, for the light it could not stop giving off. Announcing two new elements was one thing. Proving it to a skeptical scientific establishment was another entirely. To silence the doubters, she would need to isolate pure radium itself, a task that meant processing literal tons of ore by hand. For 3 more years, she repeated the same brutal process thousands of times, refining a fraction of a gram further and further. Neither of them yet understood the danger. Their fingertips cracked and burned. They thought it was simply hard, dirty work. Pierre liked to carry a sample in his pocket to demonstrations, delighting audiences by showing how it glowed in the dark. When radium burned a patch of his skin and refused to heal normally for months, Pierre studied his own wound like data. It was an unsettling discovery, and also the birth of an idea. Radium might be powerful enough to destroy diseased tissue too. Within years, radium therapy would become an early form of cancer treatment, one of the discovery's first gifts to humanity. In 1902, after nearly 4 years of backbreaking labor, Marie finally isolated 1 decigram of pure radium chloride. She then calculated radium's atomic weight with painstaking precision, the final proof the scientific world could not ignore. In June 1903, she defended her doctoral thesis on radioactive substances. It was called the greatest single contribution ever made to a doctoral dissertation in physics. She became one of the first women in Europe to earn a doctorate in science. That same month, the Royal Institution in London invited them to lecture. International recognition was finally arriving. After nearly a decade of poverty and obscurity, recognition was finally catching up to their work. The press had started to notice too. Radium was becoming a public sensation, a glowing, almost magical substance. Unaware of the risks, manufacturers began adding radium to cosmetics, tonics, and even toothpaste, promising glowing health. Marie and Pierre never patented radium. They believed scientific discovery belonged to humanity, not to personal fortune. It was a noble choice and an expensive one. Despite changing science forever, they remained financially modest for years. Then, in November 1903, a letter arrived from Stockholm.
The Royal Swedish Academy had awarded the 1903 Nobel Prize in Physics to Henry Becquerel, Pierre Curie, and Marie Curie. She was almost left off the prize entirely. Only after a sympathetic committee member insisted was her name added at all. She became the first woman in history to win a Nobel Prize. Both Curies were too unwell from years of overwork and radiation exposure to even travel to Stockholm for the ceremony. Overnight, the quiet couple from the leaky shed became world famous. Reporters camped outside their door. Marie hated the spotlight. She wanted more than anything to be left alone with her work. With the prize money, they finally installed a bathroom and proper heating in their home. After everything, they chose comfort, not luxury. The fame finally pushed the Sorbonne to give Pierre a proper professorship and Marie a paid position as laboratory chief, her first salaried scientific post. In December 1904, their second daughter, Eve, was born. For a brief time, life felt almost gentle. On the afternoon of April 19, 1906, Pierre left a faculty meeting early, his mind on his research as always. Crossing the Rue Dauphine in the rain, distracted, he stepped directly into the path of a heavy horse-drawn wagon. He was killed instantly. He was 47 years old. A police officer came to deliver the news to Marie himself that evening. In her diary that night, she wrote only, "Pierre, my Pierre, you are gone." She refused a state funeral. Pierre was buried quietly, without ceremony, exactly as he would have wanted. Days later,
the Sorbonne offered Marie something unprecedented: Pierre's own chair and his professorship. On November 5th, 1906, she became the first woman ever to teach at the Sorbonne in its 650-year history. She began her first lecture precisely where Pierre's final lesson had ended. Not a word of tribute, just continuation. Alone now, she carried both the laboratory and her daughters on her own shoulders. Years later, she would write a loving biography of Pierre, the only way she knew to keep him close. 4 years after Pierre's death, she finally achieved something even he had not: isolating radium as a pure metal, not just a compound.
Among Pierre's former students was a brilliant young physicist named Paul Langevin, a man Pierre himself had once deeply respected. Langevin's own marriage had grown cold and combative for years. He often lived apart from his wife, Jean. Marie, still grieving Pierre 4 years on, found in Langevin someone who understood both her science and her solitude. By 1910, what began as friendship had quietly become something far more complicated. They rented a small private apartment near the university, careful, discreet, certain no one would ever know. In January 1911, Marie was nominated for membership in the French Academy of Sciences, an honor no woman had ever received. The conservative press launched a vicious campaign against her candidacy, questioning her nationality, her religion, even her right to exist in French science. On the day of the vote, she lost by just 1 or 2 ballots. The Academy would not admit a woman for another half-century. Exhausted by public humiliation, she found herself leaning more and more on Langevin for support. Langevin's estranged wife, Jean, discovered their letters, and the affair was no longer a secret kept between 2 people. Jean took the letters to a right-wing newspaper editor known for vicious, scandal-driven journalism. On November 23, 1911, the story broke. By morning, all of Paris was reading about Madame Curie's secret romance. The press, already hostile from the Academy scandal, now painted her as a foreign seductress who had destroyed a French family. She had been away at a physics conference in Belgium when the scandal broke. She came home to an angry mob outside her own front door. She had to take her daughters and flee to the home of a trusted friend, Camille Marbeau, for safety. An outraged Langevin even challenged the newspaper editor to a duel over the publication. Neither man was harmed. In the middle of the scandal, another telegram arrived from Stockholm. She had won a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry. Privileged Nobel officials privately debated whether to ask her not to come to Stockholm at all, fearing the scandal would embarrass the ceremony. She wrote back without hesitation. The prize was for her scientific work, not her private life. She would attend. From Switzerland, a fellow physicist she deeply admired wrote to console her, urging her to ignore the noise and stay true to her science. On December 10, 1911, Marie Curie walked into the Stockholm Ceremony Hall, exactly as she said she would. She became the first person in history, man or woman, to win a Nobel Prize twice in 2 different sciences. The strain of it all finally broke her. Weeks after Stockholm, she collapsed from exhaustion, depression, and a kidney ailment. She spent over a year away from public life, much of it recovering quietly in England with her friend, the physicist Hertha Ayrton. When she finally returned to her laboratory in December 1912, she did so the only way she knew how, in silence and back to work.
In a modest workshop at the School of Physics, a quiet, gentle scientist named Pierre Curie was already respected for his work on crystals and magnetism. A mutual friend introduced them in the spring of 1894. She needed a bigger laboratory. He had access to one. What began as shared curiosity about magnetism slowly became something neither of them expected. Pierre proposed marriage. She refused. She still planned to return to Poland and serve her country. She went home that summer, hoping to find work as a scientist in Poland. The doors there remained closed to women. She returned to Paris and to Pierre. This time she said yes. They married in July 1895. No wedding ring, no white dress, no religious ceremony. She wore a simple dark blue dress she could later use in the laboratory. For their honeymoon, they rode bicycles through the French countryside, a wedding gift from a cousin, and their favorite shared joy. From the very beginning, theirs was a marriage built on shared work as much as shared love. Pierre secured her a small corner in his laboratory. It was cramped, poorly equipped, and exactly what she needed. In 1897, their first daughter, Irene, was born. Marie returned to her research within weeks. She kept her daughter's cradle close to her work table. There was no other way to do both. She needed a subject for her doctoral thesis, something original, something no one else had fully explored. In 1896, a French physicist named Henri Becquerel had discovered that uranium emitted a strange, invisible energy. Almost no one else was studying it. It was unfashionable, unexplored, and almost entirely ignored. Marie Curie chose exactly that. Using a sensitive instrument Pierre had built years earlier, she began measuring the faint electrical currents these rays produced. She tested every element she could find. Most showed nothing. Then she found two minerals that gave off far more radiation than uranium alone could explain. Pitchblende and chalcolite were behaving in a way no known element could explain. Something else had to be hiding inside them. She coined a new word for what she was seeing: radioactivity. Pierre recognized immediately that this was bigger than either of their individual projects. He set his own research aside to join her. The school gave them an abandoned shed to work in, leaky, freezing in winter, stifling in summer. It would become the birthplace of two new elements. A former student called it a cross between a stable and a potato cellar. To them, it was everything.
In August 1914, the First World War erupted across Europe. Marie saw immediately how her science could save lives. She personally designed mobile X-ray units mounted inside ordinary vehicles, so surgeons near the front could locate bullets and shrapnel instantly. French soldiers nicknamed these vehicles Petites Curies, Little Curies. Marie herself drove many of them to the front lines. She personally trained over 150 women as radiology technicians, since most men were away fighting. Her teenage daughter Irene worked beside her throughout the war, the beginning of her own remarkable scientific career. By war's end, her mobile units and trained technicians had helped treat more than 1 million wounded soldiers. She even tried to donate her Nobel Gold medals to the War Fund. The bank refused, but she gave her prize money instead. In 1914, just as the war began, her long-dreamed of Radium Institute finally opened its doors in Paris. After the war, the institute became one of the world's leading centers for radioactivity research, uniting physics, chemistry, and medicine. In 1921, Marie traveled to the United States, where American women had raised funds to give her something precious: 1 gram of radium. President Warren Harding personally presented her with the radium at the White House, radium worth more than her entire life's earnings. She returned to a Poland that finally existed again as an independent nation. laying the cornerstone for a Radium Institute in her native Warsaw, then went home to keep, mentoring a new generation of scientists in Paris. Decades of handling radioactive material without protection had scarred her hands permanently. Cataracts slowly clouded her eyes. By the early 1930s, her health was failing rapidly. Persistent fevers, exhaustion, a body that no longer recovered. She was moved to a small sanatorium in the French Alps at Saint-Salmas, where she spent her final weeks. On July 4, 1934, Marie Curie died of aplastic anemia, a disease caused by decades of exposure to the very element she discovered. Even today, her laboratory notebooks remain radioactive. They are kept in lead-lined boxes, and visitors who wish to read them must sign a waiver.
In 1995, more than 60 years after her death, Marie Curie became the first woman ever entombed in the Pantheon for her own achievements. Scientists later named an entire element, curium, in honor of her and Pierre. Few names in science carry that kind of weight. From a leaky shed in Paris came the foundations of nuclear physics, modern cancer therapy, and medical imaging that saves lives every single day. She once said, "Be less curious about people and more curious about ideas." She spent her whole life proving exactly that. Her name was Marie Curie. The woman science tried to ignore became the woman science could never forget.